All right. All right, so welcome everyone. I'm gonna pull up my little spiel here. Okay, so welcome to our second event in InterConnected lecture series, and thanks for joining us for our November talk. The next one will be in January. This series is a collaboration and partnership created by WKU, and feel free, professors, please raise your hand or go do a little whoop whoop for us. WKU, woo, EKU, whoop whoop, NKU, whoop whoop, UK, woo woo, Murray State. I know there's a Murray on there. There. U of L. Come on, Leslie. Where's she going? There we go. And all our regional AIJ chapters. This is a statewide design lecture series for the 2020-21 academic year. This year's focus is Black Voices of Design and aims to diversify and decolonize our pedagogical practices and design curricula. Tonight's talk is sponsored by AIJ Cincinnati, woo-woo, and EKU Department of Art and Design. So a little bit more about AIGA Cincy is one of the 75 plus affiliate chapters of AIGA, the professional organization for design. This chapter is led by a volunteer board of directors with a mission to help local creatives reach their full potential, as they believe that the growth of one is the success of all. AIGA serves the creative industry by advancing design as a professional craft, strategic adventure, and a vital cultural force. They're currently seeking members and mentees for their Embark Mentor program, or Embark Mentorship Program, sorry. This program brings seasoned design professionals together with emerging designers within the first 5 years of their career. Awesome. This program is designed to help identify and create custom plans for the mentee's goal over a 4-month period, where they will get one-on-one guidance for their paired mentor. If this sounds intimidating, don't worry. They will give you the tools needed to kick off the relationship and start other events for emerging designers as milestones along the way. So to learn more and others like it, please visit aijcincinnati.org. So thank you. All right, so welcoming our amazing guest here tonight, our speaker, Kaleena Sales. So Kaleena is an assistant professor at the graphic design at Tennessee State University and HBCU, Historically Black College and University in Nashville, Tennessee. She is endlessly interested in the intersection of Black culture and aesthetics, and believes that identities and experiences have an invaluable role in helping to diversify the ways in which designers solve problems. As a member of AIGA Design Educator Committee Steering Committee, Kaleena has advocated for more inclusive views of design history through her Beyond the Bauhaus series. The connective thread throughout her art and design work and her writing is focused on sharing minority stories in the form of advocacy to normalize Black lives and include them in the spaces where they are often excluded. So afterwards, we will have a brief Q&A to answer any pondering questions. Feel free, if you want to drop them in the chat, and we will try to get back to them, okay? Thank you so much, Kaleena, and feel free to take it away.
Thank you, Shannon. That was an awesome intro. I really appreciate being here. I will go ahead and share my screen. All right, can you guys see that okay?
Yes.
All right. So as context, as Shannon mentioned, I teach graphic design at Tennessee State University, and this is my 12th year teaching. And so when the first few years that I was teaching design, I started to notice that my students were making some similar design decisions and choices that I was making early on in my career. And so I began to be kind of curious about that. And I started to wonder about, what informs our aesthetic choices. And so how much does culture, for example, play a role in that? So I titled this talk, Systems and Outliers. And outliers in this context refers to Black designers and minority designers who, again, are oftentimes kind of on the edges of the design field. And so I'm going to examine urban minority culture and take a look at aesthetic preferences. All right, so just to start, there it sounds weird to say, but there is a such thing, obviously, as Black neighborhoods. And I hesitated saying that because I don't want to imply that there's a monolithic kind of experience for Black people, as there's no monolithic experience for any group of people. However, there's a shared experience just by virtue of being in a particular social economic class, and then just based on the history of Black people in this country. And so a little bit of history: in the early 1930s, there was a discriminatory lending practice called redlining. And so there were these maps created that color coded areas of the neighborhoods based on who lived there. So pictured in red are the areas where all the Black residents mostly were. And what that signified to lenders was that they were at high risk. And so a lot of these areas that were already populated with largely African American population were then or their economic growth was then stunted a bit. And so what you see now is a residual effect of that. And you still have areas of town that, while it may be blocks away from a nicer neighborhood, is filled with um, sometimes crime, or really a visual landscape that speaks to economic despair. And so there's a concept called mere exposure effect, and it simply means the more you see something, the more you like it. So again, if you're imagining being a part of a community that is not flourishing well economically, it's filled with textures and colors, and a sort of kind of grittiness that you don't find in, I would say, higher end neighborhoods. And so while that can be alarming to some, I think there's some beauty within that. I think there's beauty within the textures and the colors, and really the spirit of the community, of the people that live there. So continuing with mere exposure, there's something called subliminal exposure. And so what that simply means is that mere exposure effect is even stronger when words or pictures are repeated subliminally. So even when you don't have an awareness that you've seen something a bunch of times, you still end up liking it more. And I liken this to, if you grew up, let's say, in a house where someone smoked cigarettes, right? That smell of cigarette smoke might actually be calming to you, where for other people, it might be disgusting. If you grew up in New York City, the sounds of the city and kind of the noise might actually provide a sense of comfort to you, where some other people, it would be too much. So a lot of the things that we're surrounded around really seep into our aesthetic preferences. And we begin to not just get used to those things, but we begin to actually prefer them over other things. So again, imagine if this were your visual landscape or part of your normal day-to-day kind of surroundings. There have been a lot of Black artists over the years who have drawn inspiration from just that sort of environment. So Romare Bearden, for example, used a collage effect, and he was inspired by jazz music and also just by the environment in which he grew up in. And so you see his references to Black community, you see the layered torn collages, and sort of drawing inspiration again from kind of the rough, gritty nature of his environment. In the middle, we have Afrocobra, who was a Black arts collective from Chicago, who was very intentional about drawing inspiration from from Black people and from Black experiences. And so they did that in fabrication work, in typography, and in illustration and painting. And then even Basquiat, who a lot of us are familiar with, was very intentional about the inspiration from urban street culture. And so you see a lot of graffiti style, but really like iconography and symbols that relate to Black culture as he saw it. So this idea of kind of pulling inspiration from where you grow up and the people that you're around and the textures and colors and different experiences that you have is there's a long history there. It's certainly not new. What I found that was sort of new-ish was the inspiration that my students were picking up from hip hop and from the visual language of hip hop. And so if you grew up listening to 90s era rap music, you probably have seen the designs from Aaron and Sean Branch, who were brothers and founders of a design firm from Houston called Pen and Pixel. And this was their signature style. So very blinged out and very over the top in their design style. And so for Pen and Pixel, more is more. And they've written about exploiting the early capabilities within Photoshop. And they convinced a lot of these rappers who were from New Orleans and did not have a lot of money that they could save money by just photoshopping all of these things together and not actually having to own them. So you have this really kind of over the top intense collage style and this introduction of bling within the visual language and vocabulary of a lot of urban design. And so while some of these album covers were comical, today to look back on, this dominated the hip hop hip hop scene for about a decade. I owned some of these actually back in the day, I will admit. And so, if you're seeing this over and over again, it starts to kind of again um, feed your aesthetics senses. There was a write-up in the New York Times about Pen and Pixel's design style. Let me move my window out of the way. Okay, so its gaudy, dreamlike album covers were like crass, lunatic vision boards, offering vibrant Photoshop collages of palm trees and pineapples, hummers and helicopters, skulls and city skylines, and diamond-studded goblets. And I thought that was a pretty accurate write-up. So even beyond that era of like 90s hip hop, we still see the influences of that type of design aesthetic seep into urban design today. So these were flyers that were found online and an album cover from just a couple of years ago, where you still have this collage kind of thing going on, and you still have this emphasis on materialistic iconography and symbols, and then mixed with these other kind of textural elements. There's a line of snacks actually that are called wrap snacks. I don't know if you guys have ever seen them, but I had a coworker who would collect these actually in his office. But you see a lot of those same influences. You see with the example in the center, the blinged out text, and even to the right, the graffiti style lettering that we saw in some of the earlier examples. So I started to notice that there was this aesthetic duality. There were elements that signaled wealth uh, to a group of people who were oftentimes not really in positions to obtain that sort of wealth, right? So it's a sort of kind of an aspirational element. And then there was elements of street culture that were certainly existing as well. And so if you see, for example, the Rick Ross album cover, he's like donned in this extremely like expensive fancy suit, but he has a very kind of serious, tough, demeanor. We have Missy Elliott with this coat on, but then she's against this brick wall. And so even if you continue on, you see continuations of that duality, the blinged out gold and diamond kind of studded lettering. But then you have like those tough street elements joined in as well. So again, you're starting to notice these same things happening. And then just more examples here. So I started to look at my students' work and pair it next to some images of urban landscape. And so I pulled just small samples and set them next to each other. And I was really amazed at how similar they were. And so this is an example of one of the images that I was referring to earlier. And then over to the right was just a small snippet from a logo that one of my students created in class. Same thing here. The left shows an actual photo of like a basketball goal. And then to the right, the textural kind of elements that a lot of my students were drawn to in their work. And more examples of the graffiti style lettering as well that a lot of my students were really interested in. And so as it's sort of collaged here, you can't quite tell which ones are the photos, the visual in landscape images paired next to the student work because of the similarities between the two. The problem emerges though when these students are then taught that everything that they have been introduced to is wrong. And so in design school, in art school, we teach international typographic style, Bauhaus, modernism, Russian constructivism, and so we teach all of these things that are from really very specific parts of the world. And we say that this is the right way to design. But when that's paired next to all of these other examples from media and from culture, they don't go together and they contrast. And so I thought about what does that mean for my students, and what am I communicating to them as I'm teaching them about design? These are some of the things that I found were different about, let's say, international typographic style and Black urban aesthetics. International typographic style proposes simple composition, sans serif typefaces, flat colors, and logic over emotion. Black urban aesthetic, again, not monolithic, but just a general kind of overview. There seem to be more complex compositions and an interest in more expressive, ornate, or bold typefaces, textured and layered backgrounds, and then a preference for symbolism and iconography within the work. So that brings me to really considering the role of Eurocentrism in design. And if you're not familiar with that term, it's a worldview centered on Western civilization, or really a biased view that favors it over non-Western civilizations. And so I think a lot of times we don't think that we are perpetuating any sort of narrative in our teaching. But oftentimes we do so blindly because we're just following the examples that have been set before us. The problem is that singular narratives carry the lie that we all value the same things or that we gauge success through the same lens. And that's not true. I did a Google search for top graphic designers, and this is essentially what came up. There were no Black designers and very, very few designers of color at all. And I wondered about, again, the implications of that for a designer like myself and for the students that I teach. So beyond just visual and kind of like preferences, what do our experiences teach us in terms of the ways that we can interpret information? Do words mean the same? When we give assignments, are different designers interpreting those assignments differently? So these are two examples of student logo designs from students who come from different backgrounds. And so the assignment was to do a logo for a brand that we made up in class called The Yard. And the assignment was to make it urban and trendy. And so the student on the left is from Middle Eastern descent, and this was her interpretation of the assignment. And the student on the right is a Black designer from Memphis, and this was her interpretation of the assignment. And I thought, well, that's interesting. But then it continued on. semester after semester, year after year. The student on the left here is a white designer from a non-urban environment, and the student on the right was a Black designer, again from Memphis. And they were in the same class, and they were asked to basically use song lyrics to create an expressive poster. And I would argue that the design on the left would be considered good design in most situations, and the design on the right would not be. Another example, the designer on the left, I think is from Puerto Rico, the designer on the right, I believe it's from Atlanta, but just there are different interpretations of what it means to do fun, what do fun colors look like? Is it a gradient? Does it have texture? Are there ornate letters within that? And, as a designer who has worked in kind of a corporate space before, I have to check myself and say, like, why am I having an adverse reaction to certain elements? Is it because I've been taught that those are wrong, or is it actually performing, wrong? Is it not working for the project? And so, it's kind of figuring out the subjective and objective kind of point of views and our role within design. And then this last example of the student work, the idea of upscale was really interesting to me. So the student at the top was a Middle Eastern student, the student at the bottom, a Black designer. And he's a pretty good designer, but it was really interesting to me that upscale meant gold. Upscale meant, that it needed to feel very fancy, and that needed to be communicated with that particular color, and that the other designer did not feel the need to do that. So again, these are just various observations paired with my own experiences. So if I kind of grouped together the examples of the students who were not from urban environments to the left, and then the other students to the right, and I considered, what might this look like if it were in a portfolio? How would these students be assessed if they were seeking a job? What would the creative director's feedback be? Or would they even be given an interview? Unconscious bias plays a role in all of our lives. We all have some form of it. So my question was, how do our subjective preferences surrounding style interfere really with our ability to give objective criticism? I think as professors, this is something that we have to think about, but even for people who I would call the gatekeepers of the design industry, creative directors and such that are hiring designers, it's something to think about. How much are we imparting our personal views on style when we are analyzing the quality of work that's in front of us? There's a definition for unconscious bias here. It says it's often defined as prejudice or unsupported judgments in favor of or against one thing, person, or group as compared to another in a way that's usually considered unfair. And so in the next few slides, I show some old work that that's coming up. I'll show some old work that I've done that falls in line with that. But I thought this was really interesting to share. We see the presidential portraits of Bill Clinton, George Bush, and then we see Kehinde Wiley's portrait of Barack Obama in a completely different style. And a lot of people really appreciated it and had good reaction, but it was met with some comments that suggested that it was not presidential enough. And so the change in style, and honestly, the fact that it was a Black painter also that created this portrait for the first time, it was met with some criticism and some questions, and kind of that subjective nature of what is a presidential portrait and what are the rules to creating that were explored. So this is a little bit more of Kehinde Wiley's work. He's doing his twist on some classic art pieces. And it's striking to me to see how just the Black skin and the urban clothing, how it feels like it communicates something different, although the content is the same. And then even in this piece here to the left, we see that this is about, relationships, right? And we see those same relationships explored in Kehinde Wiley's painting. but they're Black women and their clothing is different, and how do we perceive them? So this is where I'll show some of my really embarrassing old work. um, but I think it really, I use this to really underscore a point. The piece on the right was designed in 2010 for like a party flyer kind of um, freelance thing that I did. And it was something I would never put in an actual portfolio. It was like for a friend, and one of those things you tuck down way low and kind of forget forget about. Um, but then, as I'm researching this concept of aesthetics and Black aesthetics, I wondered why the work that I did on the left for a brand called Cozy Mill, why I would be, even though it's just like a simple like online ad, and it's lacking any kind of real conceptual depth, or and it's just serving a really basic purpose, why I would feel more proud to show this piece in a portfolio versus this. If I dissect it a little bit more, I see that there are still elements that we teach about in class. There's hierarchy, there's contrast, and there's all of the things that we say a designer should do, but I have a negative reaction to it and I don't want to show it in my portfolio. And the main reason is because of the reaction that I would be fearful of getting from a serious designer. These are other examples of some work that I've done, kind of contrasting styles. Both of these are for financial institutions. Over to the right is for Citizens Bank, which is a Black-owned bank. Over to the left is for Central Bank, which was actually when I was working as an art director years ago in Kentucky. And kind of different styles, right? So dark and angled, and there's some slight urban elements here. And then to the left, it's a little bit flat and straight line, and a bit more streamlined in its approach. I compared icons and symbols and kind of logo designs. Over to the right was a design I did several years ago for a lady who wanted kind of a personal um, logo, and I used this gradient and this kind of ornate lettering. And then over to the left are these flat icons that typically are what I would deem as better received in a design portfolio. Um, and I believe this might be the last example of this kind of series here. Over to the right is a snippet of a design that I did for a book cover pitch. And it used, this was several years ago, but it used kind of that blinged text effect and some textural elements, dark colors. Over to the left are print ads that I did at an ad agency, completely different style, serif, flush left, you know, um, you know, pretty traditional layout. And I guess, collectively, when I was thinking back about these pieces, almost forgetting that I had done most of these, I realized that as a Black designer, I had been developing almost two completely different design aesthetics along the way. But one of them was being hidden. And so as soon as I would do it, again, would never see the light of day if I were pursuing a design career and presenting that work in front of a creative director. So I think that I think it was my response or my reaction to the bias that I expected to receive um, in the industry. So I just showed this. This is obviously not my work. This is paintings by Matisse. And he did a couple of pieces that just use different forms, a piano lesson and music lesson. And one is abstracted, one is a bit more representational. But they have the same content. There's a boy at a piano, there's a, a sculpture in both pieces, there's a garden. And so there's some content that's very similar, but the form is very different. And his in reading about this, he wanted people to consider the way that form really shapes our understanding of the meaning or the message. And so I thought that that was really interesting as it relates to aesthetics as well. Oops. I have a student who is exploring identity and bias in cartoons. And so he showed examples of different characters with distinct personalities. And so someone who's nice and someone who's a bit mean, someone who's a bit mischievous, and 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 then he compared that to, you know, our reactions if those same characters were Black. And if their kind of life story was a little bit different, would we still see this character as being mischievous, or does he suddenly have a bit more of alarming characteristics, or would we describe him as such? All right, so moving on, I started to think about the principles of design and the way that we teach design. And so, I think it's important to remember that by the time we've entered school to study design, we've already been introduced to the principles of design in our everyday lives. And so I started to really think back about, where did I learn about color? Where did I learn about shapes? And this is where I learned about color. I thought about Word Up magazine, and you can probably start to guess my age at this point, but I would collect these magazines, and they were all colorful, and the lettering was really kind of fun and vibrant. And then, shows like In Living Color and Fresh Prince and Martin. And, these were the things that I was seeing, growing up, and just as I got older as well. And it doesn't mean that these are like specific to Black culture, but if you were a part of Black culture during a certain time, you probably were consuming this media. Where did I learn about, proportion or scale? I thought about 90s R&B artists, and the oversized clothing. And I looked at the clothing of the group Escape, and I simplified it to just shapes and said, well, what am I learning about? Again, like scale and proportion and what goes together, even color palette. Dapper Dan is a fashion designer from New York who self-taught, and this was an example of some of his work. If you don't know about him, please go look him up. He's amazing. But he he created pieces without training for young hip hop and R&B artists. This is Bobby Brown back in the day, and if I'm looking at kind of the designs and I'm deconstructing those, it's teaching me about repetition, it's teaching me about line and color and shape, and it almost looks a bit like, Matisse abstracted painting, at least. I looked at the designs that Salt and Pepper wore, and the colors and the vibrancy, and that taught me about color theory. And it reminds me of Mondrian's work. So it's like, these are things that are introduced to you culturally before you even enter a design classroom. Hairstyles can teach you about repetition, and rhythm. And so I bring this up to say that um, I think that by teaching design from a lens that only good design can be pulled from certain parts of the world is inaccurate, and it doesn't respect culture, and it doesn't respect the ways in which we can pull inspiration from the things that are around us. So what are some of the benefits of, I have to speed up a little bit, I just looked at the time. All right, so what are some of the benefits of diversity? I think we can all probably say there are several, but I just wanted to summarize a few that I think are really important. One, we can gain unique conceptual and aesthetic perspectives. Two, exposure to different visual influences. Three, access to a variety of cultural experiences. And then four, we can, fight against systemic underrepresentation. And this is in regard to hiring diverse talent in advertising and design fields. All right, slowly kind of getting toward the end here. So I did think it was really interesting to touch on or to look at the psychology of aesthetics. And I read this really interesting article that, and I pulled this one quote from here. It says, objects that satisfy current physiological needs will lead to positive aesthetic emotions, so like pleasure. Those that oppose those needs will lead to negative emotions like repulsion. And so basically what I gathered from that is based on where we are in our lives, or even at the moment, we might react differently to the same images. And so we have to remember that when we're creating design work, when we're creating artwork, not everyone will have the same reaction. It might be based on their upbringing and experiences. It just might be based on what they're feeling at the moment. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so we all essentially need the same things, but the way in which we perceive those needs might be very different. So esteem or prestige feelings of accomplishment might look different for one culture versus another culture. The next few slides show a series of images, and I would love for you to consider your reaction to that in relation to where you are in your life. If you, for example, have just had a baby, you might look at this image and go, oh, it's sleeping, yay. Or if you're nowhere near that part in your life, that phase in your life, you might not have any reaction at all. If you grew up wealthy, you might see this and not really have much of a reaction. It's just kind of everyday life. If you are struggling to make ends meet, you might have a completely different reaction to this. We all will have a different reaction now to this image than if we were shown this image a year ago, right? And so, depending on where we are kind of culturally, socially, and just kind of like, within like, history really, we'll have different reactions to different images and words. And then, if you are getting married soon, you'll have a positive reaction. If you were recently divorced, obviously not. So I started to think about intuition, and I love this quote by Paul Rand. It says, intuition is a flash of insight conditioned by experience, culture, and imagination. And I thought about that as it relates to my work. So there, about I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago, I started to explore really just for visual play, pattern designs. And I didn't really think much. I was just doing and moving and interpreting colors and shapes. And I didn't realize until I looked back on the work that much of it did reflect a lot of kind of my experiences and visual inspiration that I'd gained over the years. And so these were some of the patterns and things that I'd created. I'm going to breeze really quickly through this part so I can get to the close. Historically, there have been a lot of Black artists who have used their platform to do social justice work. At TSU, we put on a show called Portraits, Poetry, and Politics. This was during the 2016 election cycle, and students were working with writers in the English department and writing poetry and then creating artwork that spoke about their feelings about the election. This is again from the 2016 cycle, but a lot of the images and the words were actually really relevant to this last election cycle as well. Some of our alumni have began art collectives. North Art Collective is based in North Nashville, and it addresses, a lot of the artists band together to address social issues. So these are some of the murals that have been done around town. This one in particular highlights the legacy of Diane Nash, Carly Magruder, Z. Alexander Luby, and John Lewis from Nashville. And so for my own work, and I've started a series called Beyond the Bauhaus through AIGA's Design Educators Community. I'm on their steering committee, and I've been so happy to have an opportunity to begin this series. And I wrote the first 2 articles about West African Adinkra symbols and Afrocobra. And the idea behind this series is really to just point to all of the many wonderful artistic and design contributions from underrepresented social and cultural groups. And so while I started the series, I continued to see contributions, and we have a wonderful series of articles that are about to be published. So another colleague wrote the one about women as the pioneers of code. And then this amazing article about the I Am a Man placard from the Memphis sanitation workers strike. And we have an upcoming one for the December that will be published in December about about a Chinese type foundry that is amazing. And so again, the idea is that we can reach beyond kind of the normal canon and really expand our view of where, you know, good design comes from. I've also recently written a book that will be available in the spring. It's called Extra Bold, a feminist, inclusive, anti-racist, non-binary field guide for graphic designers. Really long title, but I think all of those words are really important. And it's co-authored with the amazing Ellen Lupton and a host of other really incredible designers and educators. Um, in the book, I write about systemic racism through the lens of design, the difference between equity and equality, my experiences teaching Black designers, and the concept of anti-racism as well. And then finally, last but not least, over this past year, I've been doing a series of portrait drawings that really capture my view of kind of the Black experience through image. And so while there's no monolithic experience, I think that one thing that that kind of summarizes our collective experience in this country is this idea that despite the things that are happening around us, there's an urgency to continue to march forward. There's like this strength and resilience within the community. And oftentimes I depict it within like the eyes, you know, or the expression. And there's no, typically not big smiles on the drawings, you know, but I think there's like a stoic strength and beauty in the expressions. And let's see, I think there's a couple more. These are some of the more recent ones. And so I'll end here on this quote from W.E.B. Du Bois, and he does pronounce the S in his name, or he wrote that he preferred the S to be pronounced. But I love this quote because it summarizes, I think, the Black experience really well. It says, "It's a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings." And so this is from the book, The Souls of Black Folk, 1903. And that's just a snapshot of all the drawings. And that's it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Kaleena.
Stop my share. Okay.
Wonderful. That was amazing.
Thank you.
I'm trying to find my reaction button. There we go. Like, I need to clap. So just looking at the chat here, let's see. I mean, I think it's less questions right now, but feel free to put those on. Oh, when will your book be released?
Oh, the book will be released in the spring of 2021. I think maybe March. But yeah, it'll be available for pre-order pretty soon. Or actually, it might be already on Amazon.
Wonderful.
Thank you for the question.
And I know, Natalie, thank you for putting in the Beyond the Bauhaus link for AIGA. So please go ahead and check that out. What are some questions we'd like to ask Kaleena? Don't be shy now. Okay. Well, I mean, Julie, who is one of the KY educators who's doing this with us. All right, so given the underrepresentation in the design historical canon, what are some recommended books in your library?
Ooh, oh man, yeah, that's good. There are quite a few. I've been doing a lot of audiobooks just because that's I can kind of devour those a lot quicker. But White Fragility was, I think, one of the more recent ones. And then there's, I forgot the author's name. Um, and then what is anti-racism or anti-racism? Gosh, I'll type these up and send them to Shannon. Maybe she can distribute it out later. But there's so many. Yeah. There's also an amazing book. Kelly Walters is a professor at Parsons, and she has a book coming out in the spring, and it's about Black and Latinx design educators and their experiences. And so I would check that out. She's also published by Princeton Architectural Press, so it might be on their website. But I will certainly get a list together. It's hard to remember off the top of my head, but yeah, those are a few.
I, I completely understand. But yeah, I'm happy to try to share those as best I can. I'm sure Leslie and Natalie together, our forces combined, we can figure it out. Okay, so from Leslie, do you have any assignments you give your foundations or intro-level students that draw them on visual landscape backgrounds?
So I don't teach a lot of the foundations courses like 2D, 3D, and that kind of thing, or what I consider to be foundations. But in my graphic design classes, I um, almost always assign the students to like research Black designers and other designers of color, and do some sort of kind of a collective presentation about what they've learned. I think it's just really important to expose young designers um, to a variety of people that are out there working, and to introduce to them really early this idea that again, good work doesn't, just come from one area. So a lot of it's just kind of like researching designers. And then let's see. Oh, when I teach about the principles of design, I often do it kind of similar to the way that I presented here, which is I show examples of design through the lens of fashion or other media that they are used to. And so I'll say, if we're talking about unity and variety, for example, I'll say, who's your favorite art or musical artist? And, for example, if we look at Rihanna's fashion, how can we look at one of her outfits and dissect it and figure out, what's unified and where's the variety within that, where's the contrast, where's the, balance. We look at shoe design, we look at, so I try to pull things that are relevant and that are interesting to them, and teach about these kind of foundational principles, even within like my more advanced graphic design classes. Um, yeah, so
Great.
hope
Okay.
that.
Questions are piling up. Okay. So, as an African American designer, what do you recommend to do when you design and a person doesn't understand the design?
Yeah, that's tough. I think that's why I push, honestly, the principles of design really hard, because what I've learned is that if a designer can defend their work in a really objective way, then some of those subjective differences won't matter as much, or they don't have as much weight, behind them. And so, there are some really formal things that I require my students to do. And I say, does this work? Does it communicate what it needs to communicate? Is there clarity? Is there contrast? Is there hierarchy? And so if those things are working, then I think that they feel empowered to defend their work in front of, whoever they're presenting their work in front of. And if it's rejected, then, that's okay too. But I think that it's really about building up that foundation, and so that they understand why something works and why it doesn't work.
Great. How do you approach those of us who have a majority white audience in terms of students?
Um, how do you say that again? Sorry. How do you approach,
How
oh,
do you
those of us who
approach
have a
those of
majority?
those who sorry, those who of us have a majority of white audience in terms of students?
I think it's the same actually. Like I think that, well, in a lot of ways. So even if the aesthetic kind of conversation doesn't um, relate, I think that the idea of like uh, widening kind of the canon of our, you know, references and in the pool of designers that we show and the ways in which we talk about design, I think that can still be relevant to and probably is really important to do, honestly, with a majority white audience. Um, you know, I just think that all of us could benefit from that conversation. You know, so yeah, so that's what I would say.
Okay, so something about your work here. How big are the drawings that you do?
They're not very big. So I started all of the drawings that I showed were actually all done this year during quarantine. And so in order to sort of, in order to crank them out, I'm doing really small kind of like 9 by 12, 8 by 10-ish, you know, size. They're all done with marker and colored pencil. So it's not as tedious and as like a large canvas piece where I'm, you know, dealing with oils or acrylics. So I'm able to do them much quicker. Or much more quickly, yeah. So fairly small.
Do you say you do like one a week? You try to do one a week or?
Well, I was, and and then the semester kind of started, you know, getting pretty busy here. But there was a period, honestly, during the early parts. It's so interesting the different ways that we've all kind of responded to the pandemic, and during the early part of quarantine. Um, you know, I felt really relaxed and sort of appreciative of the extra time. And so what I would do is actually find quite a few hours at night after my son, you know, went to bed. And I would stay awake from about 9 to about 3 o'clock in the morning. And then I would just draw and draw and draw and draw. And so I was doing maybe two a week at one point. And then now it's like one or two a month, you know, whenever I can find time.
That is completely fair. Absolutely. Okay, so Natalie here, what advice would you give a student that feels the pressure to include all super commercial looking work over personal projects or things that better show their personality or personal aesthetic in their portfolio?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Natalie. I think this is where I think I feel limited in my role as an educator, in the sense that outside of we can teach our students to embrace, you know, aesthetics and you know all of that, but there are gatekeepers to the industry. There's creative directors, hiring directors, you know, or, you know, recruiters. And there are people that have to assess those pieces and determine if they're going to be a good fit for a job. And so I'm honest about that in the sense that, you know, I tell my students that they do have to show that they have an understanding of modernism or that they do understand international typographic style. I don't propose that any designer kind of forego those things, you know, in favor of just complete like personal projects. I think it's more about merging the two, you know, and it's finding a good balance of, yeah, of pieces that represent you culturally or just like personally, but then also show that you understand the industry as well. So that would be my suggestion. That's what I tell my students anyway.
All right. Is there a design industry that you see that is more accepting of the urban design aesthetic? Which industry do you think is furthest
Mm.
from inclusion and need the most help? Great.
That's interesting. In terms of the design, probably fashion design is most inclusive. I mean, you know, of urban design aesthetic. Um, in terms of who's furthest from it, tech companies, you know, you know, I think there are certain segments of industries that are very tied to specific aesthetics, and they feel that certain aesthetics communicate strength and kind of, you know, and so, you know, if you're in the banking industry, for example, it's really hard to, it's going to be a hard sell to say like, you know, that you should embrace, an urban design aesthetic, so just, yeah, so there's certain industries that are just going to be a little bit further removed from that. But I think the music industry and the fashion industry are doing an okay job at it.
All right, last question, but I mean, we could take a couple more, but this is the last one here. How can artists help to promote and discuss decolonization in the art standard of the art standards in the industry?
Um, how can artists help promote and discuss decolonization? I think that that's just kind of a part of just really committing to being an ally for Black and Brown people and underrepresented people, and that's in normal everyday conversations, and that's um, sharing work of Black designers, promoting work on, I don't know what, if you have a social media page or what, but sometimes it's as simple as like sharing on social media, the work of a Black designer, an illustrator, or someone who has a completely different design aesthetic, and getting that in front of people's faces so that they can see that there are more than just kind of one way to do a number of things. So I'm not sure if I really answered that, but I think it's just really taking whatever platform you have and utilizing that. But in really simple ways, is just having conversations with people around you.
All right, last question, I think, to wrap things up. Um, any thoughts on how to bring this conversation into the history of graphic design course that primarily uses the textbooks such as Escalon, history
Yes.
of, sorry, graphic design, a new history, without seeming forced and trying to fill a check mark in terms of true diversity? Mm.
Yeah, I mean, I stopped using a specific like graphic design history textbook a while back, and I tried to just kind of build my own set of resources. But I think that even if you use a particular textbook, I would just pull in a number of other resources to also introduce. So I don't, again, it's kind of like, the same idea of like not necessarily throwing away like Western influences or Bauhaus, or it's moving also beyond that and just kind of like introducing other elements as well. So, but I think it's also writing the content yourself, so it's, some things are hard to find. Sometimes you can't find the resource you're looking for. So it's creating them, it's creating it. It's doing the actual research and the actual writing and creating new resources for other people. So
Yeah, I just wondered if you had any good resources, Kaleena, in
um,
doing that.
for history in particular.
Yes.
Yeah, I think, well, and I think honestly, that's why I've started writing the Beyond the Bauhaus, because I couldn't find as many resources as I was hoping for. There's a designer named Ramon Tejada. He's a design educator that teaches at RISD, and he's amazing. And he has, I'll have to gather this list and send it to Shannon, and then again, maybe she can send it back out. But he started a kind of a file format that anyone can contribute to, and it's just like an ongoing list of decolonization kind of resources. Also on AIGA's Design Educators page, there's also some other resources there. But I would say that like there weren't as many as I was hoping to find, and so that was part of kind of my urgency and efforts in helping to create that.
Thank you. Great questions, everyone. And
You're
we've
welcome.
got a Google Doc from Catherine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Yay. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Of course.
Ramon's decalling. Yeah, that's.
Yes. I'm going to click on that before I forget.
Mhm.
Then I'll go back to the presentation. All right. Well, thank you once again. That was an amazing talk, and we are so honored that you came and was our second speaker. Sorry,
Thank
I'm
you.
really hungry, guys. It's like past dinner time for me, so I'm just like, yay. But thank you so much, Kaleena. It was a true joy, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you so much, you guys. I appreciate it.